Every year, 40,000 people tour a plantation 40 miles from Washington, D.C., and walk away without learning the truth. They admire an elegant federal mansion. They photograph terraced gardens cascading down a hillside. They hear about architectural details and horticultural specimens. And then they leave, having spent an hour on a site where 130 human beings were enslaved, without understanding what that actually meant or why it matters today. This is not oversight. This is not innocent forgetting. This is active erasure that continues right now. For more than a century, some of America's wealthiest families tested whether you could preserve a plantation while deleting slavery from the story, whether you could turn a forced labor camp into a wedding venue, whether you could monetize beauty that enslaved people created while hiding the brutality that made it possible. The experiment succeeded. Oatlands Plantation in Virginia's Loudoun County represents something more dangerous than forgotten history. It represents deliberate, systematic historical erasure that wealthy institutions maintain today. The slave quarters were allowed to collapse. The names of 130 enslaved people became footnotes. The violence, the family separations, the systematic rape, all of it disappeared from official narratives. Here's what makes this urgent. The racial wealth gap where white families have 10 times the wealth of black families traces directly to plantations like Oatlands. When museums hide this history, they obscure inequality's origins and prevent justice. The National Trust for Historic Preservation, one of America's most respected institutions, manages Oatlands and continues prioritizing architectural aesthetics over human truth. This is the story of how 130 enslaved people built everything visitors now pay to see, how their names were systematically erased, how wealthy families spent a century perfecting that erasure, and why the cover-up continues today, threatening our ability to address racial inequality or achieve any meaningful reconciliation with American history. The scandal is not finished, it's active, it's ongoing. And 40,000 people this year will tour Oatlands without knowing they're participating in it. If you want to understand how America's most prestigious historic sites lie about slavery and why that matters for inequality today, please like this video and subscribe. Comment with other plantations that have sanitized their histories. Now let's discover what happened at Oatlands and why powerful institutions don't want you to know. Chapter 1. The Carter Fortune. Built on theft. To understand Oatlands, you must first understand where Carter wealth came from. And that story begins not with business acumen or hard work, but with a system designed to steal labor across 3 generations. George Washington Vanderbilt Carter was born in 1777 into one of Virginia's most powerful families. His great-grandfather, Robert King Carter, had died 45 years earlier as the richest man in colonial Virginia, controlling more than 1,000 enslaved people spread across 300,000 acres. When King Carter died in 1732, his estate was valued at more than $10,000, exceeding the budgets of most colonial governments and representing decades of accumulated stolen labor from hundreds of people who received nothing. This wasn't wealth built through innovation or wise investment. This was systematic theft, legitimized through law and enforced through violence. Every acre King Carter controlled, every building his family erected, every pound sterling in his accounts traced directly to unpaid black labor extracted through kidnapping, captivity, and coercion. The fortune divided among King Carter's heirs, but substantial portions remained concentrated in family branches. George Carter's inheritance included several plantations in Loudoun County, Virginia, about 40 miles west of the emerging national capital. By the time George reached adulthood in the 1790s, he controlled thousands of acres and the enslaved workforce that made land profitable in Virginia's agricultural economy. He was 27 years old when he decided to build Oatlands, and he had never performed a day's productive labor in his life. Everything he owned, the land, the capital, the social position that allowed him to marry well and move among Virginia's elite, came from other people's stolen work stretching back through his great-grandfather's generation. Loudoun County in 1804 was prime Virginia plantation country. The rolling Piedmont between the Blue Ridge Mountains and the Potomac River offered good soil for tobacco and wheat, temperate climate, and proximity to markets. The land had been taken from indigenous peoples through violence and treaties that were systematically violated. Now it was divided among white families who made it profitable through slavery. George Carter chose a site on elevated ground with views across the surrounding countryside. The location was strategic, high enough for good drainage and impressive views, close enough to roads for market access, isolated enough for the privacy that wealthy families valued. This would be the administrative center of his agricultural empire, the visible symbol of Carter family wealth and refinement. But Carter understood clearly that building a mansion and operating a plantation required labor he would never pay for. By 1804, he controlled approximately 130 enslaved people whose labor he could direct without compensation beyond minimal subsistence. These 130 human beings, men, women, children, would build his house, work his fields, maintain his property, and generate his income for the next 60 years. The economic model was brutally simple and spectacularly profitable. Enslaved field workers produced crops, initially tobacco, later wheat after tobacco exhausted Virginia's soils, that Carter sold for cash on domestic and international markets. In a good year, an enslaved field worker might generate $500 worth of marketable crops. Carter provided perhaps $50 worth of food, crude clothing, and primitive shelter. The $450 difference was pure profit, stolen labor that enriched Carter while the worker accumulated nothing. Multiply that by 130 people working for 60 years, and you begin to understand the scale of wealth extraction. Conservatively, Carter and his son would steal more than $3 million in labor value in period currency from the people they enslaved at Oatlands over 6 decades, equivalent to well over $100 million in modern purchasing power. This wasn't income from wise business decisions. This was theft, systematic and sustained. The 130 people Carter enslaved were not abstract labor units. They were human beings with names, families, hopes, skills, and personalities. Though Carter's records rarely captured any of this, his ledgers listed them by first name, age, and monetary value. Tom, age 24, $800. Sarah, an infant, $600. They appear in his accounting like livestock or farm equipment, assets to be inventoried and occasionally sold. These people had no legal rights. They could not refuse work, could not quit, could not negotiate for better conditions. They could not legally marry, though they formed families anyway. They could not own property, though they sometimes cultivated small garden plots on their own time. They could not testify in court against white people. They could not learn to read or write in most jurisdictions. Their children belonged to the master at birth. This was the system that made Oatlands possible. Not George Carter's architectural vision, not his refined taste, not his business acumen. Stolen labor from 130 people held against their will through violence and legal coercion. That's what built and sustained Oatlands for its first 60 years. When Carter decided to build his mansion in 1804, he knew exactly how he would pay for it. He would purchase materials: brick, clay, timber, hardware, glass. He would hire a white supervisor to direct construction. But the actual work, digging foundations, making bricks, laying walls, cutting timber, installing floors, carving details, would be performed by enslaved workers whose labor cost him nothing beyond subsistence he was already providing. The location he chose would become the site of systematic exploitation, lasting 6 decades. The house he would build would be a monument not to his achievement, but to theft from 130 people whose names history would work hard to forget. And that forgetting, that systematic erasure of enslaved people from Oatlands' story, would become the real scandal, continuing for 175 years after slavery ended. Chapter 2. George Carter's Vision of Permanence. George Carter in 1804 was a man of his class and time, which means he was a man who considered owning other human beings not just acceptable, but natural and proper. To understand what he built at Oatlands and why, you must understand the worldview that made such construction possible. Carter was educated, well-traveled within the United States, and culturally sophisticated by early American standards. He read widely, spoke educated English, understood architectural principles from studying pattern books popular among wealthy builders. He had seen other great Virginia houses, Mount Vernon, Monticello, the plantation mansions that wealthy families were building throughout the Tidewater and Piedmont regions. He was also thoroughly convinced of white supremacy and black inferiority. This wasn't unusual among wealthy white Virginians. It was the consensus view. The entire economic and social system of the slaveholding South rested on the ideology that black people were inherently inferior to white people, that they benefited from white supervision, that slavery was actually good for the enslaved. This racist ideology wasn't peripheral to Carter's thinking. It was foundational. Without that ideology, without that self-serving belief system that allowed white enslavers to sleep comfortably in elegant mansions while human beings they owned slept in crude cabins nearby, the entire plantation system would have been psychologically unbearable for the people operating it. The ideology made exploitation feel like benevolence, made theft feel like fair exchange, made violence feel like necessary discipline. Carter married Elizabeth Grayson Lewis in 1813, 9 years after construction began at Oatlands. She was a widow who brought her own property and enslaved workers to the marriage, expanding Carter's holdings. The marriage was both romantic partnership and business merger. Wealthy planter families understood that marriage consolidated land, enslaved people, and social position. Together, George and Elizabeth would have one child, George Jr., born in 1814. What drove Carter to build Oatlands was a particular vision of permanence and legacy. He had inherited wealth, yes, but he wanted to create something that would identify the Carter family, specifically with refined taste and architectural achievement. He wanted a house that would stand for generations, that would be admired by social peers, that would communicate his family's position and values to visitors and to posterity. The federal architectural style he chose communicated specific messages. Federal architecture, America's adaptation of Georgian and neoclassical principles, emphasized symmetry, proportion, restraint, and classical details inspired by ancient Greece and Rome. The style suggested republican virtue, educated refinement, and connection to the classical tradition that educated Americans saw as the foundation of their political system. Carter wanted his house to say the Carter family is cultivated, educated, permanent, and proper. He wanted visitors to enter through the front door and immediately understand that this was a family of significance and taste. He wanted the architecture itself to demonstrate that the Carters belonged among Virginia's first families. What Carter did not want his house to say, what he worked to conceal through architectural choices, was that this refinement rested entirely on systematic violence against 130 enslaved people. The beauty he was creating depended on brutality he preferred not to acknowledge. Carter's vision included not just the mansion, but extensive grounds. He envisioned terraced gardens that would descend the hillside south of the house, creating outdoor spaces that demonstrated horticultural knowledge and aesthetic sensibility. He imagined orchards providing fruit for the household. He planned dependencies, separate buildings for kitchens, laundries, storage, that would support the mansion's operation. And he understood that creating and maintaining all of this required an enslaved workforce large enough to perform field labor, construction work, domestic service, and grounds maintenance simultaneously. The 130 people he enslaved at Oatlands weren't just agricultural workers. They were a captive labor force he could direct toward any purpose he chose. Carter's personal papers and correspondence reveal a man comfortable with slavery, never apparently troubled by the moral contradictions others were beginning to notice, even in his own time. The revolutionary generation that established American independence, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, at least wrestled publicly with the contradiction between proclaiming that all men are created equal while enslaving hundreds of people. They wrote about it, though they generally resolved the contradiction in favor of continuing to enslave people while expressing theoretical discomfort. Carter's generation seemed to feel less conflict. By 1804, the revolutionary moment had passed. The Constitution had enshrined slavery through its 3/5 compromise and fugitive slave clause. The cotton boom was beginning in the Deep South, increasing slavery's economic importance and hardening Southern commitment to the system. Northern states were gradually abolishing slavery, but they weren't demanding that Southern states do the same. Carter built Oatlands during a period when slavery seemed secure, when wealthy white Southerners could imagine that the system would continue indefinitely, when challenging slavery appeared radical rather than inevitable. He built a house designed to stand for centuries, expecting that his descendants would own Oatlands and would continue enslaving people to maintain it. This vision of permanence was not unusual. Most wealthy planters building great houses in the early 19th century imagined dynastic continuity. They expected their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren to inherit these properties and the enslaved workforces that sustained them. They built for the long term, investing in brick construction that would last centuries, in architectural details that would withstand time, and landscapes that would mature slowly into design perfection. What Carter could not imagine, what no enslaver building in 1804 seriously contemplated, was that within 60 years, slavery would end completely, that the system that made Oatlands possible would be destroyed not through gradual reform, but through violent war, that his vision of Carter family permanence at Oatlands would last only 2 generations before economic impossibility forced his heirs to sell. Carter stood on his property in 1804, directing enslaved workers to begin construction, imagining centuries of Carter family occupation. What he was actually beginning was a 60-year experiment in exploitation that would end in catastrophic collapse, leaving his descendants financially ruined and the people he enslaved suddenly, dangerously free. The house he built would survive that collapse, but it would survive only by transforming completely, by becoming something Carter never imagined, and by systematically erasing the enslaved people whose labor created every element of its beauty. Chapter 3. Every Brick a Stolen Hour. Construction of Oatlands began in 1804 and continued for 6 years, the most intensive building period, though additions and refinements would continue for decades. What emerged was not just a federal-style mansion, but a physical record of stolen labor, with enslaved people's work encoded into every brick, every board, every carved detail. The first task was creating the materials themselves. Oatlands would be built primarily of brick, more expensive than wood, but more permanent and more impressive. Tens of thousands of bricks would be required for walls that would be 4 feet thick at the foundation, tapering slightly as they rose through 3 floors. Enslaved workers extracted clay from Loudoun County soil, likely from deposits on Carter's own property. They would dig the clay, test it for quality, and transport it to brick-making sites near the construction location. The clay was then processed, mixed with water and sand to proper consistency, cleaned of stones and debris that would weaken the bricks. Each brick was formed individually by hand. An enslaved worker would take processed clay, press it into a wooden mold, strike off the excess, and turn it out onto the ground to dry. This work was repetitive, physically demanding, and required enough skill to maintain consistent quality. Poorly formed bricks would crack during firing or prove weak in the wall. The quality of Oatlands' brickwork, still standing more than 200 years later, testifies to enslaved workers' expertise. After drying in sun, the bricks were fired in kilns that enslaved workers constructed and operated. Firing required maintaining precise temperatures for days while monitoring the process constantly. Too cool and the bricks wouldn't harden properly. Too hot and they would warp or crack. Operating brick kilns required knowledge passed between workers, attention to detail, and round-the-clock labor during firing periods. The bricks were then laid in Flemish bond, an alternating pattern of headers and stretchers, short and long faces, that created both structural strength and visual appeal. This pattern required precision and planning. Enslaved masons laid these bricks over months and years, building walls from foundations to roofline, creating openings for windows and doors, installing lintels and sills. Timber work proceeded simultaneously. Enslaved workers felled trees from Carter's extensive landholdings, oak for structural framing and flooring, pine for secondary uses, walnut and other hardwoods for decorative elements. They sawed logs into dimensional lumber using pit saws or water-powered mills if available. They shaped timbers for specific uses, floor joists, roof rafters, wall framing. The carpentry at Oatlands required sophisticated skill. The roof structure alone demanded precise calculations and expert execution. Rafters must be cut to exact angles, properly spaced, and adequately braced to support the weight of roof covering without sagging. Floors required level framing, and carefully fitted boards. The decorative woodwork, crown moldings, door and window casings, wainscoting, demanded experienced craftsmen working with hand tools. All of this labor was stolen. The enslaved workers who made bricks received no wages. The enslaved carpenters who framed the house received no compensation beyond the subsistence Carter was already providing. Every hour of work enriched Carter while the workers accumulated nothing. The mansion that emerged measured approximately 60 feet wide and 40 feet deep, containing roughly 17,000 square feet of finished space across 3 above-ground floors, plus a full basement. The floor plan followed federal period conventions, a central hall running the depth of the house from front door to back, with 2 rooms on each side per floor. This arrangement provided both formal entertaining spaces on the first floor and private family quarters on the upper floors. The first floor held public rooms designed to impress visitors and demonstrate Carter family refinement. The drawing room to the right of the entrance would receive guests with high ceilings, decorative plasterwork, and careful proportions. The dining room behind it would host formal meals. To the left of the hall, a library or office would display Carter's education through book ownership. A smaller sitting room completed the first floor plan. The second floor contained family and guest bedrooms, private spaces less elaborately finished than the public rooms below, but still demonstrating quality construction and refined taste. The third floor, with somewhat lower ceilings and simpler finishes, provided additional sleeping quarters and storage. An attic above stored seasonal items and overflow goods. The basement level, partially below grade, contained the working infrastructure that made wealthy household operation possible. Kitchens, laundries, storage rooms. These spaces were hot in summer, damp in winter, and deliberately separated from the elegant spaces above. Enslaved domestic workers would labor in these uncomfortable conditions so that the Carter family could enjoy refined comfort upstairs. The architectural separation encoded enslaved people's subordination into physical space. The mansion's design allowed the Carter family to inhabit beautiful rooms while never directly confronting the labor that maintained those rooms. Meals would appear in the dining room, prepared in basement kitchens by enslaved cooks whom the family rarely saw. Clean clothing would appear in wardrobes, washed and pressed by enslaved laundry workers, whose exhausting labor remained invisible to those who benefited from it. Behind the main house, slave quarters were constructed at a careful distance, close enough for easy access when Carter needed workers, far enough to be out of direct sight from the mansion's main rooms. These were wood-frame structures, deliberately built with less permanence than the brick mansion. 1 or 2 rooms per family were typical. Dirt floors in many cabins. No glass windows, just wooden shutters. No fireplaces in most quarters, just open hearths providing minimal heat. The contrast between mansion and quarters was architectural violence, a daily physical reminder that some lives mattered enormously, while others mattered barely at all. This contrast was intentional, ideological. It communicated and reinforced the hierarchy that slavery required. While construction proceeded on the mansion, enslaved workers were also reshaping the landscape. The hillside south of the house was carved into 4 descending terraces, level planting surfaces connected by paths and stairs. Creating these terraces required moving tons of earth with hand tools, constructing retaining walls to hold soil in place, and shaping the hillside into geometric forms. This was backbreaking labor performed in all weathers. Enslaved workers dug into Virginia clay with picks and shovels. They hauled earth in wheelbarrows or baskets. They built stone walls without mortar, fitting rocks carefully to create stable structures. The terraces that Carter would later develop as ornamental gardens began as agricultural infrastructure created through forced labor. By 1810, the mansion was sufficiently complete for occupancy, though refinements and additions would continue. George Carter had spent 6 years and tens of thousands of dollars on materials, on Christopher Roots's supervisory services, and on specialized elements he couldn't source locally. But the labor itself, the thousands of hours transforming raw materials into a finished mansion, had cost him nothing beyond subsistence he was already providing. Carter moved into a house built entirely by enslaved workers whose names no one bothered to record systematically. The brickwork that visitors now admire represents stolen hours from people whose identities are lost, The woodwork that architectural historians study was created by craftsmen whose expertise enriched Carter while benefiting themselves not at all. Every element of Oatlands' beauty was created through exploitation, and that exploitation was just beginning. Chapter 4. The Golden Age of Exploitation. By the 1830s, Oatlands operated at peak efficiency as a machine designed to extract maximum wealth from 130 enslaved human beings. The mansion stood complete, the gardens were maturing, the agricultural operations sprawled across 5,000 acres, and George Carter had refined the economics of systematic theft. The 130 enslaved people performed every function required to maintain Oatlands as both agricultural operation and elite household. Their labor divided into overlapping categories, each essential to Carter's prosperity. None compensated beyond bare subsistence. Field workers, approximately 80 to 90 people, cultivated wheat, corn, and hay on Carter's extensive acreage. By the 1830s, wheat had largely replaced tobacco as Virginia's cash crop, after decades of tobacco cultivation had depleted the soil. Wheat required intensive labor during planting, and especially during harvest. Enslaved workers used scythes to cut grain, flails to thresh it, and countless hours of bending, lifting, and carrying to bring in the crop before weather could damage it. During harvest season, workdays stretched from before dawn until well after dark. Overseers pushed constantly for speed, using threats and violence to maintain productivity. An enslaved person who worked too slowly risked whipping. An enslaved person who stopped to rest without permission risked punishment. The pressure was relentless, the work exhausting, the compensation non-existent. Between planting and harvest, field workers maintained fences, cleared new land, tended livestock, and performed the endless labor required to keep thousands of acres productive. This was not seasonal work with rest periods. This was year-round labor, 6 days per week, 52 weeks per year, until death or sale. Skilled workers, perhaps 15 to 20 people, operated the plantation's infrastructure. Blacksmiths forged and repaired tools. Carpenters maintained buildings and constructed new structures as needed. Millers processed grain. Coopers made barrels for storing and shipping crops. Wheelwrights maintained carts and wagons essential for moving goods. These skills required years to learn and generated substantial value that flowed entirely to Carter. Enslaved craftsmen with specialized skills were valued more highly in Carter's accounting. Perhaps $1,000 to $1,500 each, compared to $600 to $800 for field workers. But higher monetary value didn't translate to better treatment or compensation. It simply meant Carter had greater incentive to prevent their escape and to extract maximum productivity. Their knowledge enriched Carter while benefiting themselves? Nothing. Domestic workers, perhaps 20 to 30 people, maintained the mansion and served the Carter family directly. This was perhaps the most exhausting category of enslaved labor because it required constant availability and intimate proximity to the enslaving family. Cooks prepared elaborate meals in the basement kitchen, working over open fires regardless of season. In Virginia summers, the basement kitchen became an oven. Cooks worked in temperatures exceeding 100 degrees, preparing multiple courses for family meals and even more elaborate spreads when the Carters entertained guests. The work was hot, dangerous, open fires and boiling liquids, and demanding. Meals had to be prepared punctually and meet the Carter family's exacting standards. Servers carried food from the basement kitchen to the upstairs dining room, served family and guests, cleared tables, and washed dishes. Housekeepers cleaned the mansion's many rooms, dusting, sweeping, scrubbing floors, maintaining furniture, washing windows. Laundresses washed clothing and linens by hand, hauling water from wells, heating it over fires, scrubbing textiles, wringing them out, hanging them to dry, and pressing them with heavy irons heated in fires. The mansion also required valets, ladies' maids, coachmen, stable hands, and gardeners maintaining ornamental plantings near the house. Every position demanded skills and constant labor. All were available to the Carter family continuously. Enslaved domestic workers could be summoned at any hour. A bell system allowed the Carters to call servants from anywhere in the house. Time off didn't exist in any meaningful sense. Enslaved workers' time belonged entirely to Carter. Sexual violence was endemic and systematic, though rarely documented. Masters and overseers raped enslaved women with impunity. The law provided no protection. Enslaved people could not testify against white people in Virginia courts. Resistance risked severe punishment, including whipping, sale, or death. The children born from rape belonged to the master at birth, simultaneously compounding the original violation and adding to Carter's property. The mansion's architecture enabled and concealed this violence. Masters could enter slave quarters at will without warning. Enslaved domestic workers were vulnerable in isolated parts of the house. The power differential was absolute. This wasn't aberrational behavior by a few cruel individuals. This was structural to slavery itself. When one person owns another completely, sexual violence becomes inevitable. Carter's financial records reveal the plantation's economic structure in cold, numerical terms. Ledgers tracked crop yields, sales revenues, and operating expenses with meticulous detail. Income typically exceeded expenses by substantial margins, perhaps $10,000 to $15,000 annually in profitable years, equivalent to hundreds of thousands of dollars in modern currency. This profit was pure extraction, the difference between what enslaved workers produced and what Carter returned to them. The same ledgers recorded enslaved people as assets. Carter tracked their monetary values and documented sales when he decided to sell people. An entry might read, "Sold Negro man William to Fredericksburg buyer, $900, delivered November 12, 1837. Human beings were treated as fungible property, no different in Carter's accounting than livestock or farm equipment. Carter sold enslaved people regularly. When he needed cash, he sold people. When he considered someone troublesome, he sold them." The domestic slave trade flourished after 1808 when international slave importation was banned, and Upper South planters like Carter supplied the Deep South's expanding cotton plantations with enslaved workers. These sales were devastating for enslaved families. Children were torn from parents, husbands sold away from wives, siblings separated, never to reunite. The trauma was intentional. Separation was used both as punishment and as threat to maintain control over those who remained. Every enslaved person at Oatlands lived with the knowledge that any family member could disappear at any time, sold south where conditions were even more brutal and reunion was impossible. Maintaining this system required constant violence. Enslaved people did not submit voluntarily to bondage. They resisted continuously through work, slowdowns, tool breaking, feigned illness, and periodic escapes. Carter employed overseers to enforce discipline through physical punishment. Whipping was routine. An enslaved person could be whipped for working too slowly, for impudence toward white people, for attempting to leave the plantation without permission, for any behavior the master or overseer deemed unacceptable. The whip was both punishment and terror. Its use on one person frightened all who witnessed it into compliance. Other punishments included withholding food, additional work assignments, confinement, and the constant threat of sale south. The entire system rested on making enslaved people's lives so precarious, so filled with potential suffering, that submission seemed preferable to resistance, though many people resisted anyway despite enormous risks. By the mid-1840s, Oatlands represented plantation slavery at its most refined. A beautiful mansion, maturing gardens, thousands of productive acres, all sustained by a well-organized system of theft from 130 human beings who had no choice, no compensation, and no hope that their children would experience anything different. George Carter died in 1846, having enslaved people for nearly 50 years. His will distributed his property, including the 130 enslaved people at Oatlands, among his heirs. His son George Jr. inherited the plantation and the enslaved workforce. For those 130 people, nothing changed except the name of their enslaver. The house stood elegant and complete, testimony to federal period architectural principles and Carter family ambition. Every brick represented stolen hours. Every terrace embodied stolen labor. But the enslaved workers' names were unrecorded, their contributions unacknowledged. They were architectural ghosts, present in every element, yet invisible in every account. Within 20 years, everything would change. Chapter 5. When the machine broke the Civil War, came to Loudoun County in 1861, and shattered the economic system that had sustained Oatlands for 60 years. What followed was 20 years of financial collapse as the Carter family learned what every enslaver discovered after 1865. A plantation without enslaved workers was simply an expensive house with impossible operating costs. Virginia seceded in April 1861. Loudoun County, straddling the border between Union and Confederate territory, became a war zone. Neither side controlled the area completely. Both armies seized civilian property when militarily convenient. Wealthy planters like George Carter Jr., who had inherited Oatlands from his father in 1846, faced impossible choices. For the 130 enslaved people at Oatlands, the war created unprecedented opportunities. Union lines were close, sometimes just across the Potomac River in Maryland, sometimes within miles when Union forces pushed into Virginia. Throughout Northern Virginia, enslaved people began the dangerous journey to freedom. Federal policy evolved rapidly. Initially, Union forces returned fugitive slaves to their masters following federal law. By mid-1861, General Benjamin Butler declared escaped slaves contraband of war and refused to return them. By 1862, Congress prohibited returning fugitives. The Emancipation Proclamation effective. January 1, 1863, declared enslaved people in Confederate territory legally free. Records don't document how many people fled Oatlands during the war, but the number was certainly substantial. Every escape represented someone brave enough to risk recapture and severe punishment for the chance at freedom. Every escape weakened Carter's ability to maintain operations. The workforce that had seemed permanent and controllable was dissolving. The end came April 1865. Lee surrendered at Appomattox. The 13th Amendment, ratified December 1865, abolished slavery throughout the United States. George Carter Jr. now confronted economics that made Oatlands' traditional operation impossible. Before 1865, Carter's operating costs might be $5,000 to $8,000 annually, minimal wages for overseers, plus materials and supplies. Income from crop sales might reach $15,000 to $20,000 in good years. The difference, $10,000 to $12,000, was profit generated through unpaid labor. After 1865, those economics inverted catastrophically. Maintaining even half the previous agricultural scale required hiring perhaps 60 to 80 workers at prevailing wages, $150 to $200 annually per worker, totaling $12,000 to $15,000 in labor costs alone. Add materials, equipment, and maintenance, and operating costs might reach $20,000 to $25,000 annually, while income remained essentially unchanged. The plantation that had generated substantial profits now generated significant losses. The house required constant, expensive maintenance. Without enslaved workers to perform repairs without wages, every fix became a cash expense Carter couldn't afford. Carter attempted continuing operations through sharecropping, arrangements replacing slavery with slightly less exploitative systems that still extracted maximum value from black labor. Black families rented land, paying rent as a share of crops, typically 1/2 to 2/3 of production, while purchasing supplies on credit from the landowner at inflated prices. Most sharecroppers ended each year in debt, trapped in poverty cycles lasting generations. This wasn't freedom. This was slavery by another mechanism. But it was less profitable for landowners, who now had to negotiate rather than command, and who bore some risk when crops failed. Carter struggled financially until his death in 1877. His widow, Kate Powell. Carter inherited Oatlands and confronted even worse financial realities. The house demanded upkeep she couldn't afford. Farming operations generated minimal income. She held on for 20 years by renting land, selling peripheral tracts, and allowing the house to deteriorate. This period, 1865 to 1900, marks the first phase of erasure. The formerly enslaved people who had built and maintained Oatlands disappeared from official records almost entirely. When Kate Carter sold the property in 1897 for $26,000 to newspaperman Stilson Hutchins, the bill of sale mentioned the house, land, and outbuildings. It made no mention of the slave quarters that had housed 130 people for 60 years. This erasure was active, not passive. The quarters still stood in 1865, but no effort was made to preserve, document, or even mark them. They were allowed to collapse. By the early 1900s, they were gone, demolished or deteriorated completely. This was convenient for Oatlands' next owners, who would have a blank slate. A plantation without visible slave quarters was far easier to transform into a historic estate, celebrating refined Southern living. The physical evidence of slavery could be ignored because it no longer existed in obvious forms. Chapter 6. The Eustis Project, Cleaning Blood from Beauty. In 1903, William Corcoran Eustis and Edith Morton Eustis took control of Oatlands through lease arrangements and eventually purchased the property outright. What followed was a 60-year project to transform a slave labor camp into a genteel estate celebrating Southern refinement, while systematically erasing every trace of the slavery that made it possible. The Eustises represented Northern old money with no direct slavery connection. William inherited his fortune from William Wilson Corcoran, a Washington banker who founded the Corcoran Gallery of Art. Edith came from the Morton Salt fortune. Neither family had owned plantations or enslaved people directly. What they wanted was fashionable among wealthy, early 20th century Americans, a restored Southern estate suggesting genteel antiquity without moral complications. They saw Oatlands as a federal mansion needing architectural restoration and grounds offering potential for magnificent gardens. They did not see, or chose not to see, that this was the headquarters of a forced labor operation that had enslaved 130 people. This was willful blindness elevated to decorating principle. The restoration began immediately and proceeded lavishly. The Eustices hired architects and craftsmen to repair decades of deterioration. They replaced damaged woodwork matching original profiles. They repaired plaster, refinished floors, and updated mechanical systems for modern comfort, while preserving historic appearance. The work was careful, well-funded, and historically informed. But their commitment to authenticity was surgically selective. They researched architectural history exhaustively. They studied federal period design, examined original construction, hunted for period-appropriate furniture. They investigated George Carter's life as a wealthy planter, his education, social connections, architectural taste. What they didn't research or deliberately ignored was who actually built Oatlands and under what conditions. The enslaved workers who fired bricks, laid walls, carved woodwork, dug terraces, and maintained everything for 60 years simply vanished from the Eustices narrative. This wasn't oversight. This was strategy reflecting the national white reconciliation project happening across America in the early 20th century. This reconciliation required sanitizing slavery. The Old South couldn't be celebrated if slavery's brutality remained central. So slavery was minimized, euphemized, or reframed as paternalistic benevolence. The Eustices participated in and profited from this erasure project by transforming Oatlands into a showcase of Southern refinement that never mentioned slavery. They made romanticized Old South mythology seem real and admirable. The gardens became Edith Eustis's life work and pathway to national recognition. She was a serious horticulturalist with genuine expertise and refined aesthetic sense. She transformed neglected terraces into one of Virginia's most celebrated gardens. She imported rare plants from Europe and Asia. She designed garden rooms flowing from formal to naturalistic. She combined colonial traditions with contemporary English garden design. By the 1920s, Oatlands' gardens were featured in national publications. Garden clubs organized tours. Landscape architects studied her designs. She corresponded with prominent horticulturalists, wrote articles, and established the garden's international reputation. What none of these articles mentioned, what Edith never acknowledged publicly, was that every terrace she planted existed because enslaved workers had carved them from the hillside through back-breaking forced labor a century earlier. The original. Terraces weren't ornamental. They were agricultural infrastructure created by enslaved people moving tons of earth with hand tools, building retaining walls, reshaping the hillside into geometric forms. Edith transformed this infrastructure into ornamental beauty, a genuine accomplishment, but crediting her alone while erasing enslaved workers who created the fundamental structure was historical theft. The Eustices entertained frequently. Supreme Court justices, senators, cabinet members, ambassadors. Washington's powerful enjoyed their hospitality. Guests admired the architecture, strolled the gardens, absorbed the refined atmosphere. What they experienced was carefully curated fantasy, elegant, cultured, gracious, completely disconnected from slavery's reality. No tours of slave quarter sites, which had vanished. No discussions of 130 enslaved people. No acknowledgement that beautiful rooms and gardens had been created by forced labor. The Eustises successfully created a plantation without slavery, at least in the narrative they presented. House tours discussed architectural details, furniture provenance, and Carter family history as wealthy planters, not as slave owners. Enslaved domestic workers who had cooked, served, and maintained the household weren't mentioned. The basement working spaces, kitchens, laundry, were generally not shown to visitors, preventing confrontation with labor infrastructure that made wealthy plantation life possible. By the 1930s, this sanitized version was firmly established. The house was beautifully maintained. Gardens were spectacular. Articles praised the Eustis's work. What sources didn't convey was that this was a plantation where 130 people had been enslaved. That fact was mentioned occasionally, briefly treated as minor background rather than central reality. William Eustis died in 1921. Edith continued developing gardens for another 30 years, becoming recognized as one of America's premier gardeners. Through decades of recognition and celebration, enslaved people remained almost completely absent from the narrative. Gardens were presented as Edith's creation, period. In 1965, 3 years before her death, Edith established a foundation to preserve Oatlands and donated the property to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. The foundation's mission statement focused on maintaining the house and gardens as a museum showcasing federal period architecture and decorative arts. The mission statement made no mention of slavery, enslaved workers, or the plantation economy. The erasure the Eustices accomplished over 60 years was now institutionalized in founding documents. The National Trust, one of America's most prominent preservation organizations, accepted the donation and mission without apparent concern that a plantation museum's founding documents erased slavery from the story. The Eustices had cleaned the blood off. The National Trust would keep it clean for another 60 years. Chapter 7. The National Trust Adopts the Lie. When the National Trust for Historic Preservation took control of Oatlands in 1965, the organization faced a choice. It could develop honest interpretation centering the 130 enslaved people who built and maintained the property. Or it could adopt the Eustis narrative of architectural and horticultural achievement that minimized or erased slavery. The Trust chose the Eustis narrative and maintained that choice for 4 decades. Tours beginning in 1965 focused exactly on what Edith Eustis had emphasized: federal period architecture, period furniture, decorative arts, and garden design. Docents, mostly white volunteers from local communities, received training in construction techniques, architectural styles, furniture provenance, and horticultural specimens. They received minimal training in discussing slavery. When slavery was mentioned, and it often wasn't in the 1960s and 1970s, it was typically in passing. Perhaps one sentence: the house was built using enslaved labor. These brief acknowledgments checked boxes without conveying meaningful information. Visitors learned extensive details about Flemish bond brickwork, but nothing about enslaved bricklayers who laid it. They learned boxwood propagation techniques, but nothing about enslaved gardeners. They learned about George Carter's architectural ambitions, but almost nothing about 130 people he enslaved to realize those ambitions. This wasn't education. This was continued erasure with better public relations. Physical interpretation reinforced this narrative. The mansion and gardens dominated visitor experience, beautifully maintained, carefully interpreted. Spaces where enslaved people lived and worked were either gone or not accessible. The slave quarters had vanished, and the Trust made no effort to mark their location or conduct archaeological investigation. Visitors could tour the entire property without knowing where 130 enslaved people had been housed. Educational materials followed the same pattern. Brochures focused on architecture and gardens. Gift shop books covered federal period design and Virginia garden history. Materials about slavery were scarce or absent. Visitors could leave with armloads of literature while knowing almost nothing about enslaved people who built and maintained Oatlands. The 1970s and 1980s brought revolution in slavery scholarship. Historians were producing detailed research demonstrating that enslaved people were active agents who created culture, maintained families, and resisted bondage despite enormous risks. This scholarship was transforming how historians understood slavery. At Oatlands, it barely registered for decades. Tours in 1985 weren't dramatically different from tours in 1965. Slavery might be mentioned slightly more, but the fundamental narrative remained unchanged. Oatlands was primarily an architectural and horticultural site where slavery was worthy of brief acknowledgement, but not extended examination. Other institutions made far more progress. Colonial Williamsburg began seriously addressing slavery interpretation in the 1980s. Monticello in the 1990s acknowledged Thomas Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings. Mount Vernon developed comprehensive programming about George Washington's enslaved workforce. These institutions faced the same challenges as Oatlands: limited budgets, competing priorities, concerns about visitor reactions. They chose to prioritize honest slavery interpretation anyway. The National Trust at Oatlands chose differently. Part of the explanation was structural. The trust managed dozens of properties nationwide, and Oatlands competed for resources. But resource constraints don't fully explain the failure. The organization had substantial resources. More importantly, the failure was about priorities. The trust prioritized architectural preservation and horticultural maintenance, but not slavery interpretation at the same level. Visitor feedback created economic pressure, reinforcing sanitized interpretation. Many white visitors objected to extended slavery discussion. They wanted to enjoy beautiful architecture and gardens without confronting uncomfortable history. They left negative reviews if tours dwelt on slavery. They complained that interpretation was too political. This feedback influenced institutional decisions. Management understood that upsetting visitors threatened admission revenue, memberships, and donations. The economic model creates powerful incentives to maintain pleasant visitor experiences. Honest slavery interpretation conflicts with those incentives. But economic pressure isn't moral justification. Historic sites have obligations to tell true history, even when truth is uncomfortable. The trust chose revenue over responsibility for decades. By 2000, pressure for honest interpretation was mounting. Descendants of enslaved people were demanding recognition. Scholars were criticizing sanitized plantation narratives. The trust responded incrementally. Tours mentioned slavery more directly. Educational programs included more information. The website was updated. But these were adjustments, not transformation. The fundamental narrative remained centered on architecture and gardens, with slavery as supporting context. Physical interpretation still privileged white spaces. The gift shop still sold more books about federal architecture than about slavery. Progress was real, but deeply inadequate. By 2010, Oatlands had improved significantly from 1965, but remained far behind leading institutions. The cover-up that the Eustis family began in 1903 had been modified but not ended. The trust had continued fundamentally sanitized interpretation for 45 years. This wasn't just historical failure about past events. This was ongoing institutional failure, the continued choice every day to prioritize visitor comfort over truth, architectural aesthetics over justice, and white perspectives over black experiences. The scandal that began when George Carter enslaved 130 people continued when the Eustis family erased them, and continues now as the National Trust maintains that erasure. The scandal is active, ongoing, happening at a site that 40,000 people visit annually without learning complete truth. Chapter 8. The Present Crisis. The Sanitized History. Oatlands Presents isn't just about the past. It shapes how Americans understand racial inequality in the present and will shape how we address inequality in the future. The stakes are enormous and immediate. The median white family in America has roughly 10 times the wealth of the median black family. 10 times. This disparity isn't explained by individual choices or cultural differences. This is systematic inequality with systematic causes that trace directly to slavery and the century of exclusion that followed. Plantations like Oatlands are where much of that inequality was created. George Carter enslaved 130 people for 60 years. All their labor, every hour for 6 decades, was stolen. They produced enormous wealth that flowed entirely to Carter and his heirs. The enslaved people and their descendants received nothing. When slavery ended in 1865, white families like the Carters had accumulated generations of wealth built on stolen black labor. Black families started freedom with nothing: no savings, no property, no capital. Then came a century of systematic exclusion preventing black families from closing that gap. Sharecropping trapped former slaves in debt. Jim Crow laws prohibited property ownership in many areas. Redlining excluded black families from home ownership in appreciating neighborhoods. Employment discrimination limited income. Every mechanism for building generational wealth was systematically restricted. The result is the wealth gap today. And plantation museums that hide slavery's reality make it harder for Americans to understand how we got here. When Oatlands presents itself primarily as an architectural showcase, it suggests Carter's wealth came from good business practices rather than systematic labor theft. When tours focus on beautiful gardens without adequately explaining that enslaved people created the infrastructure, it suggests white planters' achievements were individual accomplishments rather than parasitic extraction. When museums sanitize plantation history, they sanitize the origins of American wealth inequality. They obscure the direct causal line from slavery through Jim Crow to present inequality. This matters enormously for policy debates. If Americans don't understand that wealth inequality results from centuries of systematic theft, they'll oppose policies designed to address it. Reparations seem unfair if you don't understand wealth was stolen and never returned. Affirmative action seems like reverse discrimination if you don't understand. White families have received affirmative action through accumulated stolen wealth for generations. Honest. Plantation interpretation is essential for racial justice because it makes visible the mechanisms that created inequality. But Oatlands doesn't provide this education adequately. Tours mention slavery, but don't center it or explicitly connect it to modern inequality. The erasure also matters institutionally. The National Trust is one of America's most prominent preservation organizations. Its practices influence the entire field. When the Trust managed Oatlands for 60 years without adequately centering slavery, it sent a message. Such interpretation is optional. Making white visitors comfortable matters more than truth. That message shaped how hundreds of historic sites approach slavery interpretation. Conversely, if the Trust transformed Oatlands into a national model of honest interpretation, that would influence the field powerfully in the opposite direction. The erasure matters personally for descendants of enslaved people. When institutions erase enslaved people from history, they're erasing actual human beings' ancestors. Descendants experience this as personal injury and ongoing disrespect. They visit sites hoping to learn family history and find it minimized or absent. They discover institutions consider their ancestors' stories less important than architectural details. We're also approaching critical information loss. We're 160 years past slavery's end. Great-grandchildren of enslaved people are elderly. Great-great-grandchildren may not have maintained oral histories. Documentary records are deteriorating. Names are being forgotten. If institutions don't prioritize recovering information now, conducting archaeology, researching documents, recording oral histories, that information may be lost permanently within a generation. This is genuine emergency. Every year that Oatlands prioritizes mansion restoration over slave quarter archaeology is a year when irreplaceable information disappears. The philosophical question underlying all this is how Americans think about history's relationship to the present. One view holds that history is past, that we shouldn't be responsible for ancestors' actions, that contemporary Americans bear no obligation regarding slavery that ended 160 years ago. Another view holds that history is present, that we inherit both assets and liabilities, that contemporary Americans benefit from or are harmed by historical injustices in ongoing ways, that we have moral obligations to address ongoing consequences even if we didn't personally commit the wrongs. Plantation Museum's interpretation teaches one view or the other. Museums that minimize slavery teach that history is past, something to appreciate from comfortable distance. Museums that center slavery and connect it to present inequality teach that history is present, something we're living with and responsible for addressing. Oatlands' interpretation, despite improvements, still leans toward the first view. It treats slavery as historical context, rather than ongoing legacy. It doesn't force visitors to reckon with how they benefit from or are harmed by slavery's aftermath. This is inadequate because slavery's legacy is not past. The racial wealth gap exists now. Systemic racism operates now. Mass incarceration happens now. Educational inequality persists now, all traced directly to slavery and Jim Crow. Plantation museums that don't make these connections explicit fail their educational mission. They allow visitors to consume beautiful architecture and gardens without confronting origins or their own relationship to ongoing inequality. The question is whether institutions like the National Trust will accept these responsibilities or continue prioritizing comfortable narratives. The answer determines not just how we understand the past, but whether we can address inequality and achieve any meaningful reconciliation with American history. Chapter 9. What honest history requires. Oatlands can do better. The National Trust must do better. Here's what honest interpretation requires. Acknowledge 60 years of institutional failure. The Trust should publicly recognize it managed Oatlands from 1965 to present without adequately centering slavery. This deserves direct acknowledgement, explanation of how it happened, and commitment to specific improvements with timelines and accountability. Empty apologies accomplish nothing. Center enslaved people in all interpretation. Every tour must begin with slavery, not architecture. Visitors should understand Oatlands was a slave labor camp before hearing about federal period design. The primary narrative should be about 130 people held in bondage, with architecture and gardens as elements within that larger story. Standard tours should cover who was enslaved, names when recoverable, what work they performed, how they were controlled through violence, how they maintained families despite separation threats, how they resisted, what happened after emancipation, what happened to descendants. Only after establishing this foundation should tours discuss architectural details. And when architecture is discussed, enslaved labor must be acknowledged. This brickwork was created by enslaved workers whose names we don't know. These gardens exist on terraces carved by enslaved people through forced labor. Transform the physical landscape. Markers should identify where slave quarters stood. If reconstruction is feasible, at least representative quarters should be rebuilt. The quarters should be integrated into mandatory tour routes. Ideally, tours should begin at the quarters site. Archaeological investigation is essential and urgent. Systematic excavation can recover enormous information about daily life, material culture, and community practices. Findings should be displayed through markers, exhibits, and incorporation into regular tours. Invest in research and publish findings. The documentary record should be researched exhaustively by professional historians and published accessibly. All recovered names should be memorialized physically, perhaps on a permanent wall listing every identifiable enslaved person. Family structures should be reconstructed from available evidence. Engage descendants meaningfully. Hire genealogists to identify and contact descendants. Invite them to participate as paid consultants. Advisory board members with actual authority and featured speakers. Their perspectives should inform institutional decisions. They should have genuine authority over how their ancestors' stories are told. Commit dedicated resources. All this requires substantial funding. The Trust should commit dedicated resources specifically for slavery interpretation, archaeological investigation, historical research, descendant engagement, educational program development, staff training. This funding shouldn't compete with general operating budgets. It should be dedicated permanently to honest slavery interpretation regardless of leadership changes or shifting priorities. Lead the preservation field. The National Trust has resources and credibility most institutions lack. Oatlands could become a national model demonstrating that centering slavery doesn't threaten financial sustainability. It can attract visitors specifically interested in serious historical engagement. Leadership requires courage. It means accepting that some visitors will object. Some donors may reduce support. Some traditions must be abandoned, but leadership creates opportunity to influence the entire preservation field, to educate millions more honestly, to help descendants see their ancestors appropriately recognized. Oatlands has spent 120 years demonstrating how not to interpret plantation sites. It could spend the next 20 years demonstrating how to do it right. Chapter 10. The scandal continues. Today, Oatlands receives approximately 40,000 visitors annually. They tour the mansion, walk the gardens, attend special events. Most leave without understanding that they've just spent an hour on a site where 130 people were systematically enslaved, their labor stolen, their families threatened, their lives controlled absolutely by people who considered them property. The interpretation has improved since the Eustis era's total erasure. Tours now acknowledge slavery more directly. Educational materials discuss it more extensively. The website includes information about enslaved people's experiences. Progress is real, but honesty requires more than acknowledgement. It requires centering enslaved people's stories, not treating them as footnotes. It requires physical interpretation, making slavery visible in the landscape, not just verbal mentions. It requires institutional courage to prioritize truth over comfort. The scandal of Oatlands is not just that slavery happened there. Slavery happened at thousands of sites across the South. The scandal is that powerful institutions spent 120 years deliberately obscuring that reality, creating sanitized narratives celebrating beauty while burying brutality. George Carter enslaved 130 people. That's the foundation of everything visitors now admire. The elegant mansion, the spectacular gardens, the refined taste on display. All of it was created through systematic exploitation that those 130 people had no choice about and benefited from not at all. The Eustis family knew this history and chose to erase it. They spent 60 years transforming a slave labor camp into a gentleman's estate where slavery could be ignored. They created a space where white Americans could enjoy Southern aesthetics without confronting Southern guilt. The National Trust inherited that erasure and maintained it for 6 decades. Despite mounting scholarly criticism, despite changing professional standards, despite pressure from descendants and activists, the Trust prioritized visitor comfort and financial stability over interpretive honesty. That prioritization continues affecting how 40,000 annual visitors understand American history. When they tour Oatlands and leave without truly grasping that 130 people were enslaved there, without understanding the violence that sustained the system, without connecting slavery to modern racial inequality, that educational failure perpetuates the injustice. The physical landscape tells the story of these choices. The mansion stands beautifully maintained, receiving constant investment and care. The gardens are meticulously preserved, celebrated in horticultural publications. But the slave quarters are gone, their locations unmarked, their archaeological potential unexplored. The differential preservation writes slavery out of the landscape, even as words attempt to write it back in. This matters because Oatlands isn't unique. Across the South, plantation museums face similar choices about whether to tell complete truths or maintain comfortable myths. Many have made more progress than Oatlands. Some have made less. But the pattern remains. Institutions that profit from displaying sites where slavery occurred continue struggling to center slavery in their narratives. The question facing Oatlands and the National Trust and the preservation field generally is whether incremental improvement is acceptable or whether more radical transformation is necessary. Other institutions have demonstrated that centering slavery is possible and sustainable. The question is whether Oatlands will follow their lead or continue lagging behind. Standing on those terraces today, visitors see gardens descending the hillside in carefully designed terraces. They see the mansion rising behind them, elegant and refined. They see a landscape that appears peaceful, pastoral, timeless. What they should see, if interpretation succeeds, is a landscape created by enslaved people. The terraces were carved by workers who had no choice. The mansion was built by craftsmen whose skill generated value captured entirely by George Carter. The peace and beauty depended on systematic violence. This doesn't mean the architecture isn't worthy of preservation or that the gardens aren't beautiful. It means appreciating these achievements requires acknowledging how they were created and maintaining that context constantly, prominently, unavoidably. The scandal of Oatlands is ongoing. Every tour that focuses primarily on architecture and gardens while minimizing slavery perpetuates the erasure. Every dollar spent on mansion maintenance that could fund archaeology at slave quarter sites continues differential preservation. Every institutional decision prioritizing donor preferences over interpretive integrity extends the scandal into the present. The 130 people George Carter enslaved built Oatlands. They fired every brick. They carved every terrace. They created the wealth and beauty that 40,000 visitors now pay to see annually. Their labor was stolen. Their names were erased. Their descendants have watched that erasure continue for 160 years. We cannot undo slavery. We cannot restore stolen wealth or stolen lives, but we can stop lying about it. We can demand that institutions tell complete truth. We can insist that preservation includes preserving difficult histories, not just comfortable ones. The scandal continues until enough people say, no more. No more sanitized tours, no more erasure, no more celebrating beauty while hiding the bondage that created it. The question is whether you'll be one of those people demanding change. Will you visit Oatlands and ask the hard questions? Will you refuse to accept comfortable lies? Will you pressure the National Trust to do better? Will you support institutions that tell honest history? Will you use whatever platform you have to demand that plantation museums finally acknowledge slavery's centrality? The scandal of Oatlands will continue until we stop it. The choice is ours. Thank you for staying with this difficult story. If this investigation made you angry, good. That anger is appropriate and necessary. The next time you visit any historic plantation, demand honest interpretation about slavery. Ask the questions I've outlined. Leave detailed reviews holding institutions accountable. Support organizations like Whitney Plantation that center enslaved people's stories. Tell me in the comments. What other plantation museums have you visited where slavery was minimized? What did you see? What was missing? Let's build public accountability. Subscribe for more investigations into how America's most beautiful historic sites hide its ugliest truths. Like this video if you believe the National Trust must be held accountable. The scandal of Oatlands will continue until enough people demand it end. Be one of those people. Thank you for watching. Now go demand change.